Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for people to log in, and we'll be getting underway through the TDSB Budget Town Hall as soon as possible. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for joining us at this evening's TDSB Budget Town Hall. I'm Ryan Bird from our Communications Department, and we'll be taking you through this evening. Before we get underway today, I, though, would first like to read our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. It really is important for us to have the opportunity to hear directly from you during this budget process this evening. We're joined tonight by Executive Officer of Finance, Craig Snyder. Craig will begin today's town hall with a presentation that provides some high-level information about the budget process, as well as a snapshot of our current financial status. During this time, you can ask questions and share feedback using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Then we'll get to your questions following the presentation. After the presentation, we'll take some time to answer as many questions as possible. We will do our best to group common themes together so that we can get to as many questions as possible. And just please note that we won't be able to address really school-specific questions here today. Those are best brought forward to your school principal or superintendent. Today's session will be recorded and posted on the TDSB's budget website if you don't get a chance to watch the entire thing or would like to refer back to it, along with the session from earlier today. Without further ado, let's get started. I'll throw it over to Executive Officer of Finance, Craig Snyder. Craig?
Thank you, Ryan, and good evening, everybody. So tonight, we'd like to Good evening and welcome, everybody. Sorry about that. I had myself on mute. So tonight we're going to go through the following agenda. Ryan graciously did the land acknowledgement to start our evening off on the right foot. I'll do some quick introduction of myself. We're going to go through the budget timelines, the Ministry of Education regulations requiring a balanced budget for school boards. We'll talk about the grant for student needs. We'll talk about the board's operating deficit. And finally, we'll talk about the options to balance the budget. And then, as Ryan said, we'll take questions at the end. So tonight, Ryan Bird, is our Executive Officer of Government, Public and Community Relations, is with me. And I'm Craig Snyder, the Executive Officer of Finance. And one of my main responsibilities is preparing financial statements and the budget for the board's consideration. So under the Ministry Regulations 231 of the Education Act, boards are required to have a balanced budget. They are allowed to have up to an operating deficit of 1% or the maximum of their reserve balance, which is ever the lesser, without looking for ministry approval. In TDSB's case, that's approximately $28 million. However, the board did have a larger than 1% deficit last year. They had a 1.4% and required ministry approval. And the board presented a 3-year deficit recovery plan, of which 23-24 will be year 2. And in that plan, we committed to having a deficit reduced down to $15.1 million. So I'd like to talk now briefly about the grant for student needs. So the grant for student needs is where the school boards get a majority of their funding. And the grants for student needs, or GSNs, you'll hear it referred to sometimes, is based heavily on enrollment. There are some set amounts within the funding model, but for the most part, it's based on the enrollments. And typically it's announced in the March or April timeframe, and this allows boards time to calculate their expenditures and their revenues to submit a budget to the ministry by June 30th of each year. This year, we are forecasting the GSN for TDSB to be about $3.1 billion. And the next slide provides a breakdown of those grants. And I'll go through some of these quickly just to give you some familiarization. So starting on the right-hand side, where the largest piece of the pie is a pupil foundation grant. And this represents the base funding for teachers, ECEs, EAs, classrooms resources, and paraprofessionals. The next wedge below it at the 5 to 6 o'clock position is the school foundation grant. And that really provides funding for principal, vice principal, school office staff, and their supplies. The next three grants are primarily academic grants. The special education grant supports the needs of our special education students within the district. The language allocation represents both the French as a second language and English as a second language allocation school boards get to support those programs. And then the Learning Opportunities Grant provides allocations for a wide spectrum of students at risk of academic success. The Teacher Qualification Grant is just a recognizing that teachers are different levels of their experience and provides for that funding for that. And then the remainder of the grants are really administrative or renewal or school operations grant, which represents the maintenance, caretaking, and utility costs of the board. So what were some of the highlights from this year's grant announcement that was announced on April 17th? One of the main ones was around student transportation. The model has been changed significantly from what it was and provides for funding for drivers, funding for vehicles, funding for public fares, and public funding for fuel. Right now, for the first year, it's a positive impact for TDSB, and in the future years, it will see based on our new collective, new contracts with our carriers that'll start in 24-25. There was funding for remote learning or virtual learning for the administrative, the office staff, the principal, vice principal, and office administration for our virtual school. There was a realignment of Indigenous education funding, which better represented support for our Indigenous education programs with our students and is based primarily on enrollment in courses. There was also labor-related changes, and these increases for school staff and teaching staff were incorporated into the budget for the instructors of military education. There were some temporary grants that were moved into the grant for student needs. So these were grants that we received in previous years and spent in the appropriate ways, and now they've just been moved from temporary grants into permanent grants. And then lastly, for the school operations grant, non-staffing, the benchmark was increased by 2%. It's important to know, as you know, in your own household bills, that inflation is well above 2%, but the ministry only provided for 2% for our supplies, caretaking, maintenance, and our utilities. So one of the other highlights for the grant for student needs was the discontinuation of the COVID learning recovery money. And this was money that was temporarily provided to school boards in 21-22 and 22-23 to support learning and safety of our students during the pandemic. And this funding is discontinued starting in 23-24. For TDSB, this is approximately 522 positions or $31.5 million. Of these 522 positions, TDSB decided to keep 40 of the school-based safety monitors in to promote school safety in the secondary panel, and this added $2.3 million to our budget situation. The remainder of the positions remain vacant, even in the 23-24 school year. And this slide shows you those positions that the 522 were funded by the COVID Learning Recovery Fund. So next, I'd like to talk about another revenue source for the board, which is the priority and partnership funding. And this funding is supplemental to the GSN, and it's either limited time funding from the ministry or funding that they haven't encapsulated into the GSN, and it has specific purposes it's for, as well as reporting requirements. So these usually are what we consider one-time in nature to support a program. And in this, there's a couple of grants that are very important that were announced this year, and individual allocations of school boards were provided. The first was the math strategy, which was a PPF, was discontinued. However, it was replaced with math recovery plan, which is approximately the same amount, and the focus of this grant is a little bit more on direct support for students. The professional assessment and evidence-based reading program, which was $1.5 million, has been discontinued. However, new funding to support early reading and reading intervention totaling 9 million was added. So this is a positive change that we are appreciative of, and will support the early reading in our schools. There's also an $11.1 million of new funding to support transitions to students going to high school and de-streaming. So this grant is focused on grades 7 through 10 to support students as they transition to high school and their transition in the first couple of years of high school. All these funding sources I'm talking about, we're still awaiting more detailed information on the requirements for the spending on these, but we do believe that many of the programs that TDSB already has in place are supported by these programs. The last area that we have, the school board has revenue, is around our revenue sources. And listed here are 4 of the primary largest revenue sources outside of ministry funding. The first is permit revenue. So obviously when we permit space for either our fields or our gyms in the evening or weekends, that's permit revenue to help support the costs of the board. We also have closed sites that we lease to other organizations, or we have childcares within our sites that we lease space to. So we have leasing revenue that comes in. Interest revenue is from our bank deposits, and you'll notice that we have a significant increase in our interest revenue. As you see the interest rates, even today there was another interest rate hike announced by the Bank of Canada. And while we are seeing an increase in our interest revenue, as we'll talk about later on the expenditure side, we're also seeing an increase in our expenses related to inflation as well. And then our international student fees, these are students that come to Canada to learn and on our school board, and we're slowly seeing that come back to what it was pre-pandemic level. But all these funding sources did see a significant decrease due to the limitations and restrictions that were in place during the pandemic. And we're starting to see them increase to their pre-pandemic levels, which is a good sign for the fiscal health of the board. So I'd like to talk now and turn to looking at the expenditure side of the organization. So in the expenditures, there are very few expenditures that are truly discretionary to the board and do not directly support students. Our operating expenditures for 23-24 are estimated to be $3.3 billion. And when you look at the major components of it, 81% is used for instructional purposes. The teachers, the paraprofessionals, the ECEs, the principals, vice principals, the school budgets, the computers and technology that support learning in our system. Our building and operations, so the caretaking, utility charges, and maintenance account for about 13% of our expenditures. Student transportation home to school accounts for about 2%. Administrative charges are around 2%, and then all other miscellaneous expenditures are also around 2%. So you can see a vast majority of our expenditures are spent to support our students and their instruction. This next chart gives you a breakdown of how we spend the money. So the first big wedge that you obviously see from the noon till about 9 o'clock position is salaries and wages account for 73% of our spending at TDSB. In addition, the next wedge from the 9 o'clock to about 10:30 position is employee benefits are 14%. So combined, 87% of our budget is spent on salaries and benefits. And that's what you'd expect in an organization that's heavily labor intensive to support the learning of our students. Our supplies and services account for 7%. Our fees and contractual service for such things as our technology licenses and things like that are about 4%. Other miscellaneous expenditures are around 1%. Our interest charges on capital, which are funded by the ministry, are 1%. And you can see our rental expenses and our staff development don't even make 1%, but are very small wedges in how we spend our dollars. So what are some of the challenges we face? Well, some of the big challenges are around statutory benefits. They continue to increase with not offsetting funding sources coming from the ministry. And we'll go into a little bit more detail of that in a slide coming up. Also, we've seen with the pandemic, sick leave in our school costs go up significantly higher than we anticipated. You're seeing across all the school boards in the province, actually. It's not particular to TDSB. And then as we talked about on the interest side of the equation, we're getting a large interest in revenue. We're also seeing inflation impact our expenditures. So our utilities are going up, our paper supplies, all the expenses that are operational have been going up as well, at a high pace. And in school safety, we have invested, as I talked about a moment ago, with the 40 safety monitors. We have maintained our level of school safety from 22-23 to 23-24, and that's been maintained for the safety of our students and staff. However, there are some other challenges around where we spend more than the funding that we receive. And some examples include our special education, where we spend significantly over our funding allocation. Our lunchroom supervision is above the funding level. Our student nutrition program and outdoor education are two other areas. And we have presented to the trustees a long list of where we are overspent compared to the funding we receive. But I'd like to spend a few moments talking about those benefit cost pressures. As you can see by this chart, the long-term disability cost over the last 5 years has gone up by 13.9 million. WSIB has actually gone down first, so that's a good news story. But Canada Pension and Employee Insurance, which is almost $30 million, this is where we have no control. There's nothing we can do. These are statutory requirements, and these haven't been funded by the Ministry of Education. And then, as I spoke about earlier, sick leave school base has gone up almost by 12 million. So over the last 5 years, we've seen $47 million pressure to our benefit costs. So I'd like to take it now and talk about the financial position of the board. So in February 2015, prior to the grant, in our finance budget enrollment committee, we projected a deficit of $61 million. As I spoke about earlier, we kept those 40 school-based safety bars that were funded by COVID, which add 2.3 million to our financial position. When we got the GSN and did the analysis and looked at all our cost drivers, we actually saw a slight gain on our deficit of 1.6 million. So basically neutral coming out of the GSN. So our forecasting was pretty accurate. Therefore, our financial position currently is $61.7 million coming out of the downside from the GSN. School-based costs account for 68% of our board's budget. So school-based staffing is done in March to allow time for our principals to do their staffing committee, set up their school organization, and determine their classes for the fall prior to the end of school year. In March, therefore, we do our school-based staffing, and we added 9.4 million of reductions that were approved by board, in addition to those reductions due to COVID learning recovery positions. In May, the board approved adding back 8 secondary VPs and 20 elementary VPs to the system to support the needs of the system. 18 of these positions, the 8 secondary and 10 of the elementary principals, will be carried through one-time funding from previous years that wasn't utilized due to the restrictions of the pandemic. But 10 of these positions did add up pressure to the budget of $1.4 million. So therefore, the net decrease in school-based staffing was $8 million, which represents about a 0.4% decrease in our school-based staffing costs. So with that school-based staffing, it brought our projected deficit down to $53.7 million. As I talked about earlier, we had a commitment to the ministry that we'd achieve a deficit of 15.1 for 23-24 as the second year of our deficit recovery plan. So therefore, we need to find further reductions of 38.6 to achieve this amount. So I'd like to talk briefly about our budget drivers, because these are important, and these were approved at board on March 8th, and were approved as part of our budget development for this year. And there's 6 ones there listed: staff allocation to support students, student safety and staff safety and mental health and well-being, student success and engagement, equitable access to learning opportunities, including Indigenous education, human rights, and modernization and accessibility. So these drivers have both been used to look at options to balance, but also where we want to keep our investments in our education system. So they've been used for both purposes. So what options are we looking at to balance to bring us down to that 15.1? The first one is really not an option to balance, as an opportunity that, in discussions with the Ministry of Education around our special incidents portion, or SIP, And this is where school boards have to employ two or more than two full-time equivalent staff to support students with intensive health or safety needs and their students around them. And this is a process where we have to put the resources in place and then apply for it. Typically, the application deadline usually ends in December of each school year, and supports, as I say, must already be in place. The ministry has agreed to extend the deadline for TDSB to ensure as many eligible claims as possible are submitted. Working with our special education department, we anticipate an additional $5 million of funding through this source. So the next thing is we looked at our central staff, and we looked at changing our model support to schools, which results in 44 coaching positions centrally being removed from learning centers, approximately 11 per learning center. And then we looked at our centrally assigned principals, and we decreased them by 1 per learning center, as well as 1 from the director's office. So these savings total $5.6 million. The next one was looking at our central departments. So our central departments have been done over the multiple years where we've had deficits, have been reduced significantly to support keeping as much of our program and our resources in schools. So we asked central departments to look again at their discretionary budgets and save 5%. And they had to look at things like their supplies, their PD, their technology needs, and we asked them to reduce by 5%. In addition, staff are reviewing all license and contractual agreements to see what can be paused or discontinued. We project savings in this area through these budget reductions about $1.7 million. In our general interest courses, and these are courses offered to adults and seniors, and they include such things as dance classes, yoga classes, art classes. And currently the expenditures on general interest exceed our revenues by about $600,000. And under policy 19 of continuing education, community programs should be fully funded by user fees or other revenues. So staff are reviewing ways to fully fund general interest programs in 23-24, including fee increases and possible enrollment threshold changes. In other grants and efficiency, so the board receives funding outside the GSN, like I talked about earlier on, through PPS. And these are enveloped for certain purposes. And some of these grants couldn't be spent during pandemic due to the restrictions that the pandemic brought to school board. So staff are looking at these grants to ensure these carryover balances are used on eligible expenses. The funding can be charged and we can support our students. And we are also looking at how we are delivering our programs to ensure they're delivering efficiently and effectively. And as a result of this work, we believe there's 4.6 of savings to the grants that we can bring into assisted balancing the budget. The next one is looking at our one-to-one device strategy. So I'll give you a little bit of background on this first. So we are currently deploying one-to-one devices across our district. And typically we buy the devices in the late spring, early summer. They are configured by our vendor and they're delivered to us and deployed in the fall to our students. So the devices that'll be deployed in 23-24 are currently on order this year and charged to this year's budget. So what we're suggesting is pausing the program in 23-24 so that we don't purchase next spring and summer devices for 24-25, but we'll wait to see how our financial position is 24-25, and hopefully we can order those devices within the 24-25 budget and they'll be deployed in the fall. So it'll be a delay in deployment. But by deferring the program for this 1 year, this is about a $9 million savings. So the next one is around virtual schools. So we are continuing to offer a secondary virtual school next year. And the ministry, as it outlined in the quotation here, is allowing school boards to work collaboratively on offering remote learning. So we've been approached one of our neighboring boards to provide remote learning to their secondary students on their behalf. And we are working through this, and we expect this to bring us revenue of about $300,000. The last option we're looking at is around the use of proceeds disposition. So just to give you some background around proceeds disposition are when we sell a property that's surplus to the needs of the board. And so as a result of moratorium on school closures, we have excess capacity that we can't address right now. And the ministry no longer used to provide funding, what they call top-up funding, where if a school wasn't at full capacity, funded as if it was at full capacity. So both we don't get this funding any longer, and we have a moratorium, we can't close schools. So staff estimate the cost of operating the excess capacity to be around $12 billion. So we're recommending that the ministry, that we use our proceeds of admission to offset these costs that we can't avoid right now during the moratorium. And just as the last nugget on the screen says, we currently have an active uncommitted POD balance of $85 million, as well as being in an active real estate market. We don't see this being a large drain on the resources of POD in the long term as a short-term solution. So all those options I've talked to you about equate to $38.8 million. You can see the list here on the screen as they are. So we take those into account. That means we're at a projected deficit of 14.9 million. And again, as we talked about previously, we are committed to getting to 15.1. So we've made our commitment to our deficit recovery plan under this proposal. So I just want to talk a few minutes about timeline. So tonight we're doing a virtual town hall. We did one this afternoon, and Stacy Zucker, Associate Director, and I have been attending ward forums Monday and Tuesday to present the same thing that will be presented tonight to ward forum. On Monday, June 12th, we have a special finance budget enrollment committee for the public to depute on the budget. So if you wish to depute, you can contact through our deputation website and depute on a concern you have with the budget. On the June 13th, we're going to have another special epic the next night where we're going to review the feedback we received through the ward forums and through the web town halls we've done tonight. And we'll have further discussions with our trustees around the options to balance. We'll take that information away and we'll prepare the final report for recommendation to the Finance Budget Enrollment Committee on both the operating and capital budgets of the board. And then we're hoping that the Finance Budget Enrollment Committee will endorse it and send it on to the full board for approval at a special board on June 22nd. So that's the timelines we're working at currently. So with that, that concludes our presentation this evening. And Ryan and I help to take your questions and hopefully answer them for you.
Thank you so much, Craig, and thank you for joining us again. Or if you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we are going to try to get to as many questions as possible this evening while trying to group similar questions together. So with that, we will get underway. First up, a question about why is the TDSB cutting swimming programs for September 2023? How does the TDSB feel about knowing this, that swim skills are life-saving? Craig, I just want to be clear on this. At this point, at a committee level, this idea to reintroduce some instructors has been introduced, but it has not yet passed board.
Right. Thank you, Ryan. So when we talk again about the March staffing process, staff brought a recommendation at the time that we thought would bring us down to 80 aquatic instructors. And that was based on the idea that we have repairs and maintenance we have to do to our pools, and depending, some pools close for a month, some close for 3 or 4 months, depending on the need to do those renovations. And we were understanding at the time that there would be no impact to the program. On further understanding that we found that there would be a marginal impact to this program, and there is a recommendation coming from a trustee to reinstate 6 aquatic instructors that would ensure that all schools will have full programming next year.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think that also answers another question that we have. Sources of revenue, including permits and leases. School pools often lease use to external swim programs. This person is concerned with the reduced swim programming in which students get swimming every other week, meaning that students who attend the very school have less access to the school pools, whereas these external organizations use the school pool more. I think that access piece about every other week, I think that's what Craig was speaking to, in the fact that the motion that has been brought forward is to reintroduce 6 additional instructors to maintain the same level of programming. So that still has to be approved by board. So I hope that answers your question on that. Next up, staffing at 87%. It's certainly our greatest asset, but we are getting to the point where that's all we've got. The teachers boots on the ground, need more tools to do our job. What can the TDSB do? Raise more money or get the government to understand that without a boost in funding, the board commits itself to a downward spiral of reactive measures rather than proactive and forward thinking? Craig, I think it's fair to say that our trustees have passed various motions over recent weeks and months, and quite frankly, years, about predictable, sustainable funding, and have appealed to the government, whether it's to cover $70 million in COVID-19 related costs, fund a larger of the gap when it comes to special education. Did you want to add on that? Like it's been a fairly consistent appeal.
Yes, I think that it's important to note and give our trustees due credit that they do keep advocating with the government as well as staff, and that we talk about, you know, the need to fund education fully and effectively. But it's also our responsibility as staff to ensure that we're being efficient and effective with the funds that we do have, and ensuring that we're improving our programs and our delivery models as technology and program needs change. But we do continue to advocate with the ministry for funding to support the costs that are to educate our students.
Okay, thank you for that. Next up, a question about why school safety is not a budget driver. In fact, it is a budget driver. School safety, it's student and staff safety, mental health and well-being. So that is one of our budget drivers. Talking about costs associated with the TDSB research department, I don't have exact costs of what that department would cost, like any other specific department, but that would be, I think, as part of central administrative costs overall. Is that fair to say?
Yes, Ryan, that's true. It's part of the central administrative costs.
Thank you for that. A question up about one-to-one device policies. Why was this implemented? What's the purpose of these devices are being purchased? I think, stop me if I'm wrong, Craig, but overall, I think there is that movement to gradually move to a one-to-one device to student ratio, just given the importance of technology in education today, and to make sure that we're evening the playing field and that money is not a barrier to access to these computers. I think that the step that you outlined was that the computers being bought this summer will continue to be bought for next year. It's next summer's computers that have been paused to address some of our budget challenges?
Yes, that's correct. It is the reason for the one-to-one is we want to make sure as we evolve as a society and technology becomes more important for us, that all our students have access to it and that our teachers can use it for effective instruction as well, to what the question was asked earlier. So that was the rationale for the one-to-one strategy. And it was something that during the pandemic was very important to get as much technology out. We had funding for the ministry to do some of that work to make sure that technology was in the hands of the students during the pandemic as well.
Thank you for your question. Another question again about aquatics instructors. I think we've addressed that earlier through Craig. Next up, I'm also curious why the deficit recovery plan is so aggressive, and if someone could speak more to that. Craig, is that because of it really has to be done in 3 years?
So thank you for the question, and I'll do it this way. So we had this year we project a $40.4 million deficit, and we're using reserves to cover it. But we only have so much reserves, and it's important to have reserves so that in a rainy day that something happens, you have those reserves you can go to. So we can't continue to draw down on those reserves until they're extinguished. And the ministry is very concerned that we have reserves available for rainy day issues should they come along. So like you do in your personal account, if you have extra expenses, you have a leaky roof one year, you may have to go into your bank savings to pay for it. And that's what we've been doing through the pandemic time. But we now need to balance our budget so that we're living within our means. And we have to do it in a process that doesn't, leaves us with some reserve. So that's the process we're trying to go through.
Thank you for that. A question just about, we got a couple more on aquatics instructors, Craig, so we could answer this one. Someone wanted additional information on the comment that reductions in aquatic staffing had marginal impacts. I think what you were referring to was that initial conversation where we did anticipate that there would be marginal impacts, but then as Craig pointed out, and as we pointed out in committee meetings, you came back and said after further review of the situation, there are larger impacts, and essentially told trustees that at the committee floor, on the committee floor. Now that proposal has come back for 6 additional aquatics instructors, which upon further review, we believe would maintain the current programming. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's exactly it, 100% right, correctly.
Okay. And then someone else talking about, is now the time to relook at our guiding principles originally used with the swim staffing. I think right now this is about maintaining the current level of staffing. Again, we'll have to see if board does approve that motion that did come back. That's what I think the idea behind the proposed 6 additional aquatic instructors are. But I think it really is about maintaining current programming if possible.
Yeah.
Next up, the principal and vice principal of our school are split between 2 schools. We have been told that we have lost half a vice principal for next year. This means our school will have 1/4 of a VP. Our school is a model school. How does this make sense? We also have 3.5 teachers for 4 grade 4, 5, 6 classes, meaning kids are dispersed into different classes and lose continuity and sense of belonging. Does this happen all across the board? I think it really depends on what is impacting the school. Like I know some of it, to your point off the top, we have the reduction in the COVID-19 recovery funding, which did impact some numbers of VPs and in fact, some numbers of teachers, depending on where that is. But since this is very specific, I don't know, can you offer any other additional information on that?
No, I can't really, because it is school specific. I would suggest you talk to your principal and superintendent to get more full information about the unique nature of the schools you're speaking to. But I'll just say that we try to allocate our resources as effectively as possible to support the needs of our students and our staff in the system. And it is a tough, challenging, because you have limited resources, but we try to make sure that we're addressing the most urgent needs.
Okay, thank you for that. Next person asks if there's a concern that those schools that are deemed not at full capacity, that the ministry would take those schools and sell off to go towards funding deficits. I think at this point in time, as we have for years, we have a long-term program and accommodation strategy that outlines how we address some of those capacity issues at schools. We have the secondary program review coming up. The Ministry of Education has a moratorium on school closures already in place. So at this point, I don't think there's any indication that's on the horizon.
No, you're right, Ryan. The moratorium is in place, and we're hopeful that it'll be lifted soon, because we want to offer viable programs. Small schools can't offer the full breadth of program a regular large school can. So that's important, as well as the financial issues. But when we sell school properties that are surplus to the needs of the board approves that, those proceeds go to doing renewal at schools in the schools that remain. So we need the moratorium lifted, and the planning departments will do their due diligence, will do the proper consultation, and bring the recommendations to our board that are appropriate.
Thank you for that. We got a couple more aquatics instructors questions. Swimming. Why are we not setting our programming expectations first and then setting our budgets based on programming rather than the other way around? My understanding is it really was about maintaining the current programming in place was the idea behind that motion that is to be voted on, if I'm understanding the question correctly. Will there be aquatics programs for students with developmental disabilities? These programs were in place prior to the pandemic. I'd have to really speak with staff to determine next steps. I would assume so if that was part of our regular programming, that there would be room for that, but I'd really have to speak with not only special education, but aquatic staff. So I'm sorry, we just can't answer that at this level right now. Moving on, our kids are already struggling with packed classes and lack of support. Really hard to see what is happening. I think what you've heard outlined today is various cuts, adjustments that will, Craig, is it fair to say will impact the least amount possible that we can work on, like the classroom and students. Yeah. I think that the whole point of all of these reductions is to meet our budget demands, obviously, but try to do them the best we can to reduce the impact to the greatest extent possible on students.
Yes, and that's what all school boards face, is with limited resources, how to most effectively use them to support their students in the most effective way. So that's what we try to do with every budget we develop, working with our academic colleagues, is develop a plan that provides the best support for our students, that they can succeed and be safe.
Thank you, Craig. Again, if you have any questions, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are going to try to get to as many as we can. And if not, and we've answered all those, we can wrap up shortly. Could you speak to the impact of reducing staff on school climate and the association costs of long-term disability and sick leave. Relatedly, has the board policy on school safety considered the impact on staff leaves and associated costs? Craig, I know this is something we've been looking at for a number of months now, is the impact of whether it be sick days or what have you, and a shortage of staff to be able to fill those roles, which we've made some progress, but.
Yes, and it is a concern, and like I say, it's happening in other school boards as well, and we have redeployed some central staff to schools to help mitigate against those issues we're having with staffing in this current environment. It's something we're watching very closely, and our employee services department is working on additional strategies to help support ensuring that we have the right staff in the schools to support our students.
Okay, thank you. Again, if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A section. I'm just looking at our screen. Someone speaking to the meeting budget demands at the expense of students. I think that's exactly what we highlighted in the fact that we are trying to avoid any impact on students by the strategic decisions that have been made by trustees so far. Obviously, the budget obviously put the current budget process in place and having trustees vote on things that essentially will try to reduce any impact to students. And I think that's been one of the number one focus points for them since the beginning. Just looking is, according to Mr. Craig, the special education spending greater than funding. For me, the special education teacher, there exists substantial and serious differences. Funding in special education is limited. Could the board facilitate a special meeting to further discussion? I think my understanding is that the special education spending is greater than funding. And I think that's been like that for as long as I can recall, but a number of years. We don't believe that the ministry provides enough money to cover special education supports for students. So we use money essentially intended for other things, or we receive from different areas to go above and beyond.
Yes, we as a board have always felt that our special education students need to be supported as much as possible. So we haven't spent, as you say, Ryan, over to the other part of the person's question, a discussion. I would suggest if you attend SEAC, our Special Education Advisory Committee, they deal with this with staff on a regular basis and have discussions around program impacts and advise our special education department to support our students as well.
And just our final question here, what is the impact of budget cuts on specialized schools? I don't believe there are any specific cuts that are looking at specialized schools.
No, there are no specific cuts that are looking at specialized schools. We are looking to ensure that our class sizes across the system are as close to the standards as possible, but there is nothing special for reductions for specialized schools.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this evening's budget town hall. We have gotten to all of the questions that were asked. We hope you found this session informative. We will be sharing feedback we received today with all trustees as they continue to make budget decisions in the weeks ahead. As mentioned, today's session has been recorded. We'll be posting that to the TDSB budget website as soon as we can. You can visit that at tdsb.on.ca/budget for the latest information now and anytime. We'll also be hearing budget deputations at the Finance, Budget and Enrollment Committee meeting on June 12th at 4:30 p.m. The deadline to register for that delegation, for a delegation for that meeting is Friday, June 9th at 12 p.m. Please visit that same budget website at tdsb.on.ca/budget for more information. On behalf of Executive Officer Craig Snyder, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Our thanks to Zoe McGroarty and Ronnie Levy for helping making tonight's session run so smoothly. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your evening.